thank you to everybody. Thank you, Hannes, for this very motivating speech, because you talked about my future book, so damn, I have to write them now. And thank you to everyone who has decided to award my work with this very prestigious and meaningful prize. Again, as Hannes mentioned before, Bruno-Kreisky was a very leading figure in a part of Italian history which I studied and lived and wrote about, the reconciliation between Italy and Südtirol. So it's a really great honor to be here. So this is a moment of friendship and celebration, and it's wonderful to be here. However, I must confess that in these weeks and months, I find it difficult not to feel a heavy heart, even in the happiest occasion. And I'm sure that every single person in this room knows what I mean. The times we're living are bewildering, cruel, bloody, terrifying, fast, and certainly historically significant, but signifying what? Leading us where? We have no idea. So here we are in a room dedicated to Bruno Kreisky, so I assume that most of you are as interested in the world news as I am. And yet, my guess is that not many of you have ever heard of the ethnic cleansing I am about to tell you about. When I was in my 20s, in 1992, the date is important, as you will see, I was in Nepal with a fellow filmmaker. And we decided to record the totally ignored plight of the Lhotshampa, the ethnic Nepalis who had just been chased away from Bhutan. Bhutan is the Himalayan kingdom so famous and idealized by us Westerners because of its so-called happiness domestic index. The new king of Bhutan had decided to turn his country into a mono-ethnical, exclusively Buddhist place. So he set out to eliminate all the Lhotshampa, the Hindu Nepalis, who had lived there for countless generations, forcing them to flee to Nepal. So my friend and I went with our camera to the refugee camp, which the UNHCR, as usual, had put up for these many thousands of exiled people. And it was in the lowlands of Nepal, in Terai. It was a dismal place, like all refugee camps are. Makeshift tents, hunger, dirty, unschooled children. To add misery to misery, it had been placed right in the middle of the dry bed of a seasonal river. And everyone knew that the monsoon would soon turn it into a hellscape of toxic mud. We interviewed several people, especially women, and they told us their stories, which were, and the ethnic cleansing enacted by the dreamy kingdom of Bhutan had unfolded according to the usual playbook of all ethnic cleansings: the gang rapes, the loved ones killed in front of one's eyes, the flight at night with nothing but one's clothes on, the loss of livelihoods and homes. We shot a lot of material. When I returned to Italy, I offered it to several television broadcasters. None of them was interested. The answer I got was always the same. There is an ethnic cleansing going on now as we speak in Bosnia, in this moment. So nobody cares about that other one. I answered that, of course, nobody was interested in it and nobody cared about it because nobody was informing about it. But to no avail. Our material never made it to the news. And that's when I learned a very important lesson. There are less popular and more popular humanitarian catastrophes, less and more popular wars, less and more popular ethnic cleansings, less and more popular genocides. I told you this story because I want to talk to you about a behavior which I see enacted very often everywhere around me in these times as a response to the many crises that are happening and which often worries me even more than the events themselves, because it has to do with people's cognition. And cognition is where the world starts and ends for all of us, human beings. The place where we perceive the world and then react to it, navigate it, make decisions about it. Our cognition is that all-powerful tool, or rather that most precious of places, which de facto shapes the world in which each one of us lives. Tyrants and propagandists have always understood this principle very clearly. If you work on people's cognition, more than half of the hard work of establishing tyranny is already done. I call this behavior, this worrying behavior, selective empathy. Mind you, we humans, we two-legged, hypersocial, warm-blooded creatures endowed with language skills, we just can't, as in we're not able to feel exactly the same amount and depth of connection towards the fate of all human beings in the same way. Our loved ones will always receive a different kind of attention to that bestowed unto unknown people in faraway lands, no matter how sincerely invested in a better world we all are. We shouldn't be neither proud nor ashamed of this incapability, because it's a product of natural evolution, and it serves a very good purpose, the survival of our species. So I'm not talking about the different degrees of empathy we feel towards people who are more or less close to us in our lives. I'm talking about the empathy that we, the Western audiences, entrust on the human beings who have the great misfortune of being in the news. The people who, with their own bodies and lives, and with the bodies and lives of their loved ones, are living through the actual horrors and pain and destruction that we get to know about as we sip our coffee in the morning. By most accounts, we don't know those people personally. However, we might have a stronger or weaker connection to their culture and to their plight and to their land, depending on whether we have traveled there or not. If we have a personal or cultural connection with those places or not. And of course, this tinges our perception and our interest for what is happening over there. So the facts of the world can be divided into two great categories. Those which might at best provoke only a sporadic and general compassion, because we feel no personal relationship with them, assuming that we even get to know about them at all. And those in which we do have a personal investment. So the first type of crisis is like the ethnic cleansing of the Lhotshampa Nepali from Bhutan in the 90s. In the more than 30 years since then, I have told the stories very often, quite a few times, and the vast majority of people express bafflement at how they had never even heard about it. The very few who had indeed heard about it were, without exceptions, those who had some connection with the Indian subcontinent. And I am curious, could you please, be honest, please, could you please raise your hand if you had heard about this ethnic cleansing of the ethnic Nepalis from Bhutan? Okay, 3 people in a very politically conscious room. That's what I mean. In the same way, my guess is that among us in this room, by the way, a very white room, very few people have ever visited Sudan or have any personal or cultural connection with it. And those who have visited the Democratic Republic of Congo are probably even less, if any at all. So the wars and humanitarian catastrophes which are unfolding in Sudan and the DRC are unrelated to the personal experience of most of us. And this distance is perpetuated by the disinterest expressed towards these crises by the mainstream media, and so on, in a constant feedback loop of disregard. So the humanitarian catastrophes which so many human beings are going through in Sudan, not to mention in Congo, get very little attention because we're fed very few news about them, which in turn prompts to us to give them even less attention. Our disinterest and ignorance are both the cause and the effect of the fact that none of these crises is presented to us as something of importance, something in a word which really has something to do with us. The selection of what is relevant and what is not, what story of human suffering should move us and even prompt us to do some, or to ask for some political response, and which one can be barely mentioned or even not mentioned at all, is of course the result of a very complex mix of history, geopolitics, hegemonic interests, habits, even fashionable fads. Do you remember when everybody was talking about the Tibetans? Well, hundreds of thousands of Tibetans are still in exile in India in a condition of statelessness, thereby at the mercy of their Indian host. And those who have been left behind in Tibet are still severely punished by the Chinese if they don't assimilate. Nothing much has changed since the times when Richard Gere was having his daily tea with the Dalai Lama. If anything, things have gotten worse, but the plight of Tibetans is no longer in fashion. Therefore, nobody, or very, very few people ever talk about the Tibetans now. Then there is a second group of events. In the story I just told, that would be the ethnic cleansing of Bosnia. This second group of crises, at least, are brought to the forefront of the public conversation and policy. And this, in turn, is both the reason and the effect of the public's enhanced investment in them, again, in a feedback loop. In other words, they are front-page news. They are present in our political debate. We mention them when we have dinner with our friends. But, and this is what I want to draw your attention to, this enhanced investment has a potential dark side, too. This is when the simple and sincere interest for the fate of our fellow human beings becomes a validation of our personal identity. I'm not talking about the identity of the people undergoing those crises, the unwilling and unfortunate protagonists who are bombed, killed, raped, starved. No, I'm talking about the identity of the spectators of the crisis, the identity of those who are not being bombed, nor being starved, nor being killed, but who are looking on. Our identity, in other words. And precisely this overblowing of an identitarian approach to the world news, and what news they are in these times, is what I want to draw your attention to, because it worries me more than I can say. This identity-led selective empathy was quite visible already since Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. I keep on mixing up the century. But it literally exploded after Hamas pogrom in October 7th, with the kidnapping of the hostages and Israel's war against Gaza. So this is what I see everywhere in our Western lands. I see vast numbers of citizens who feel acutely, sincerely outraged by the disproportionate violence of Israel's retaliation in Gaza, by the frankly unbearable scale of human suffering, destruction, hunger, death, which has been showered for a year and a half now on the Palestinians. And these citizens express their dismay and anger at the state of things, and they rightfully express their indignation, as they should. The Western governments were doing not much to stop this apocalypse or pain, or even worse, in some cases are aiding and abetting it. But I also see how so many, too many, of these same concerned citizens have not managed to speak even one single time, not even once, in solidarity and outrage for the certainly no less unbearable scale of human suffering which Putin's Russia has been showering on Ukrainians in the 3 years since his full-scale invasion began. They have never voiced, even once, their active indignation against Putin's regime, nor demanded that the Russian army leave Ukraine immediately, as any invader should be asked by democratic societies. Too many of these rightfully appalled citizens, and I am one of them, who have shared news about the destruction of hospitals, the tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, the maimed children, the pregnant women starved by the blockade of relief trucks, and the premature babies dying in cribs without electricity. Too many of these citizens have not been able to say anything about the destruction of Mariupol, whose picture after the invasion were no less a mass of rubble than Gaza is now. Not a word about the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, which is the quintessential act of extirpation of a people's next generation, which under international law defines the crime of genocide. Not a word about the catastrophe of the ecocide which has followed the blowing up by Russians of the Novakhovka Dam, whose toxic poisoning of a swathe of land as large as a small-sized European country will be felt by generations. Not a word about the horrors of Bucha, not a word about the daily pummeling of civilians in Kharkiv. Yesterday, there was a thermobaric attack on Sumy, Kyiv, going on as we speak. Not a single word. Why not? Well, there are so many reasons that it has taken me a whole book to write them. My latest one. But if I had to explain it and summarize it in one word, I would say identity. For many people whose whole political and cultural identity is founded on the belief that only the Western European colonial powers first and then the hegemonic USA are the dark agents of history, of empire's most violent traits, for too many of them, it has been impossible in the 3 years since Russia's full-scale attack on Ukrainian land, cities, and especially bodies, to grow at least some curiosity about, let alone to acknowledge that other violently dark imperial forces can exist. And there is another one. In the last century, there has been another one in world history, Russian imperialism, all the way through the experience of the USSR, and then now with the return of a quasi-czar plus aristocracy system, which is the Putin regime. I suspect that many of them feel that if they were to learn about this other half of world history, that imperial violence and brutality well beyond the confines of Western agency, which the Poles, the Baltics, the Chukchi from Siberia, the Chechens, the Tatars, the Circassians, and countless other peoples of the vast Eurasian expanse, but most of all, or at least as much the Ukrainians know all too well, that if these people were to understand how much of the planet's history they have completely ignored, their whole identity would be threatened. So they refuse to do it. And Ukraine, and especially Ukrainians, seem not to exist for them. But the reverse is also true. I can't speak of the public debate in Austria, and I am so thankful to the Präsidentin that has said such strong words on the Netanyahu's government. I really must express my personal thanks. But I live half of the year, even more than half the year, in Berlin. And I have been appalled and in disbelief at the verbal contortions that many politicians, if not most politicians in Germany, make when asked about what is going on in Gaza, at how they present the suffering of the Palestinians as something like a biblical plague, a climate disaster, a portentous calamity, which is happening for mysterious causes, all in order to avoid naming even once the word Israel. And yet, many of these politicians have positions regarding Ukraine which are full of nuance, of understanding, of rightful solidarity towards a brutally attacked land, even more so now in the face of the US probable betrayal. And I agree wholeheartedly with their claim that we Europeans must now support Ukraine, not just in a spirit of solidarity, but because this is in the clear interest of our own self-defense and our self-preservation as democracies. So all these people are perfectly capable of feeling empathy and solidarity with the suffering of bombarded people. And yet, all too often in Germany, public expressions of solidarity for the catastrophe befalling Gaza are sanctioned with official political decisions, like in the latest deplorable case of the 4 deported students. Why? Why? Well, again, the psychohistorical reasons are very complicated. Some are historically obvious, some less. But that's a book for a German author to write, not for me. I am an Italian. All I can and I will say that, seen from the viewpoint of an outsider, as I am, albeit one who comes from a country whose history has many ties with Germany's darkest past, this bewildering selective empathy of the official discourse on Ukraine and on Gaza comes from the refusal to acknowledge that something about Germany's deeply held views of itself, grown out of a repentance for the crimes of the past, which is indeed a world-unique golden standard of a collective effort to come up to terms with the past, which I'm not discounting, but which, however, needs to be radically revised, at least if it is to keep up the post-Nazi democratic Germany's sacred promise of always being on the side of human rights. In other words, I would define it as a crisis of identity. But it's not only Germany. In many other Western countries, politicians have been gaslighting their citizens by either pretending that the horrors of Gaza are not taking place when their citizens know perfectly that they are, or that they have no known cause when their citizens know perfectly well what the cause is, just as clearly. So too many of our elected representatives, both national and in the EU Parliament, have claimed adherence to European values in the support of Ukraine while blatantly ignoring them elsewhere, failing thus to defend them convincingly as an expression of a consistent ethical stance. On the other hand, as we've seen, many citizens too have failed to see the world beyond their fixed, immutable identity, to extend their solidarity beyond an identitarian bias, and so after 3 years, they're still refusing to admit and correct their blatant ignorance of Russian imperialism. And I, as a European progressive, must sadly acknowledge that the lack of solidarity for the plight of democratic Ukraine under a full-scale attack of totalitarian terror has become a failure of historic proportions by many progressive civic societies. So this mutual, somehow mirroring, half-blindness on the part of too many elected representatives on one side and too many engaged voting citizens on the other, in which both of them extend their moral sympathies to one of these two situations of grave crisis and ignore or attribute no value nor reasons to the position of the other, this is a very bad thing for our democracies. And since the greatest difference between democracies and authoritarian regimes is that exactly this, that both elected officials and citizens, we share together the responsibility for the upkeep of democracy, I hold both of them responsible for this failure. There's something self-absorbed, very self-centered in all of this. However, that we in the West, both as public opinions and as public officials, tend to be over-preoccupied with ourselves is frankly no news to anyone who has even the slightest knowledge of the last centuries of world history. So frankly, this is not the darkness which worries me most. What I'm deeply worried about is seeing how this empathy has been hijacked by identity. Whenever someone on social media posts a picture of, say, a woman cradling the shattered body of her dead child after the bombing of a kindergarten in Ukraine, very soon a comment comes, inevitably, along the lines of, "And what about the dead children in Gaza?" Or when the portraits of the Israeli hostages kidnapped by Hamas and stuck to the street posts in New York Street were torn apart by protesting students in solidarity with the Palestinians. In both cases, this is what I see. One humanitarian hell used to undermine another one. And I can't think of anything more dehumanizing. And just as dehumanizing is the obscene concept, that if an act of violence is more present in the news than another, then its victims are to be considered less worthy of solidarity because of this privilege. As if 30 years ago, according to this obscene logic, I should have said, the lucky Bosnians of Srebrenica who get so much more attention than the Lhotshampa of Nepal and Bhutan. On this continent, we have already lived a time in which the suffering of countless human beings was considered as worthless as that of insects, as deserving of disinterest and contempt. And this by people who all the while took good care of their families and friends and of the people they identified with. This is why I'm so worried. And this is what I'm so worried about. That if we start again to divide human beings between those who are deserving of our identification and our empathy and our solidarity and those who are not, we are going back towards that same very dark path. And 80 years ago, tomorrow, we had sworn to never, ever walk down that path again. I want to finish with the most recent news concerning the Lhotshampa, the Bhutan Nepalis. After many years in that ghastly refugee camp, several thousands of them were relocated in the USA. And there, one presumes, they have worked, fallen in love, gone shopping, quarreled with their spouses, gotten sick, maybe died. Just like the Tibetans in India, however, they were never granted US citizenship, only resident rights. Now, Donald Trump, a world-class champion of instrumental dehumanization, plans to expel them all. But where to? Nepal doesn't want them. They were never its citizens in the first place. The happy kingdom of Bhutan wants them even less, as you can imagine, even assuming the Lhotshampa would ever consider going back there, which, of course, they don't. So their plight has not ended. But I guess this is a good reminder of a simple fact, which sometimes we forget. Human beings on all parts of the world keep on living and dying, smiling and suffering, even when we, the infinitely more fortunate and too often narcissistic spectators living in the opulent West, do not accord them even the tiniest shred of our attention. Thank you.